It was the sound of a child's broken sob that cut through the thunder of roaring engines, a sound so fragile, it made even hardened men pause. The street was silent, but for that tiny voice, trembling and cracked, "They broke my toy, and they hit my mom." Those words, carried on the wind, reached the leather-clad bikers who had stopped their convoy on the outskirts of the small, dying town. And in that moment, something shifted, in their eyes, in the air, in the world itself. If you believe in kindness, in standing up for what's right, and in second chances, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, a single act of compassion can change everything. The town of Riverton had long been forgotten, an industrial skeleton left to rot after the big factories closed. What remained were the people who couldn't afford to leave, single mothers, old veterans, broken families, and a handful of men who still carried the scars of their pasts on the open road. Among them was Mason Cole, a former soldier turned biker, a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. He led the Iron Vultures, a group with a reputation that teetered between menace and mystery. They weren't saints, but they weren't devils either. They rode for brotherhood, for escape, and maybe, deep down, for redemption. That day, they were riding through Riverton to deliver supplies to an old army buddy's food drive. The factory gates loomed like rusted teeth in the distance, and the streets were eerily empty until they heard that cry. Mason turned his head toward the sound, pulling his bike to a slow stop. Near a crumbling curb sat a little boy, no older than 6, clutching the broken pieces of a small, red toy truck. Beside him, his mother, a young woman with bruises blooming on her cheek, struggled to stand, wiping the dirt from her face. The bikers dismounted, boots thudding against the cracked pavement. The boy's eyes were wide with fear at first. People had learned not to trust men in leather jackets and roaring engines. But Mason crouched low, voice rough yet gentle, asking what happened. The boy pointed toward the old factory up the road, the one that still belched smoke, though it wasn't supposed to be operating anymore. "They work there," the boy whispered, "the men who took my toy. They said my mom shouldn't come back. She just asked for her pay." Mason's jaw clenched. He knew that factory, a shadow company that had reopened under corrupt owners, paying desperate workers pennies for backbreaking labor. Rumors said they used intimidation to keep people silent. Mason glanced at the mother, whose trembling hands clutched her son protectively. Her name, he later learned, was Lily. She'd been working double shifts to keep food on the table, but when she asked for her overdue wages, the foreman and his men laughed. When she wouldn't leave, they shoved her down, and when her little boy tried to defend her, they smashed his toy under their boots. For a moment, no one spoke. The boy's tiny shoulders shook as he whispered, "They said we're nothing." The bikers looked at each other, rough men who had made their own mistakes, but who still understood what it meant to be treated like nothing. Mason stood slowly, his shadow stretching long across the street. "Stay here," he said quietly. "We'll handle it." The Iron Vultures turned their bikes toward the factory. Engines roared to life like thunder rolling in from the horizon. The ground trembled beneath their wheels. They weren't police, and they weren't heroes, but that day, they became something more. Of the factory sat at the edge of town, half its windows shattered, a crooked sign reading Riverton Steelworks still hanging by a chain. Inside, a handful of men in grease-stained shirts laughed around a fire barrel. They didn't hear the bikes until it was too late. One by one, the engines cut off, leaving only the echo of boots and silence. Mason pushed open the rusted door, the metal screeching like a warning. The foreman, a thick, sneering man with a beer bottle in hand, squinted at them. "What's this?" "You boys lost," he mocked. Mason didn't answer. He simply picked up a shard of red plastic from the floor, the same color as the boy's broken toy truck. "You broke something that didn't belong to you," he said, voice low. "Now you're gonna make it right." What followed wasn't chaos, but justice. Mason didn't raise a fist, he didn't need to. The foreman saw something in those eyes, the quiet, dangerous kind of conviction that no weapon could fight. "You owe that woman every cent," Mason said, tossing an envelope onto the table. "And you'll make sure no one in this town goes hungry again. You got that?" The men nodded quickly, the mockery gone from their faces. The message was clear: if they wanted to keep their factory running, they'd start doing it right. By evening, the bikers rode back into town. The boy was still sitting on the curb, his mother's hand in his. When Mason stopped in front of them, the child's eyes lit up as he saw something shiny in the biker's hand, a brand new red truck, the same kind as before. Mason knelt and placed it gently in the boy's palms. "Keep this one safe," he said softly. "And remember, nobody gets to make you feel small." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she whispered a thank you, her voice breaking. Mason just nodded and turned away. But the boy ran after him, tugging at his jacket. "Mister," he said, his small voice trembling, "you didn't tell me your name." Mason looked down, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," he said before revving his bike and disappearing into the fading sunset. The next morning, whispers spread across Riverton. The factory had paid its workers in full. The foreman had changed overnight, treating the crew with respect no one thought possible. And on the main street, outside Lily's small house, a new sign hung above the door: "Community Kitchen, free meals for all." Nobody knew who funded it. But every week, before sunrise, a convoy of black bikes would roll by quietly, dropping off boxes of supplies before vanishing into the mist. As months passed, Riverton began to breathe again. The once empty streets saw children playing, laughter returning where silence had reigned. And sometimes, when the wind carried the low rumble of distant engines, the townspeople would smile, knowing the iron vultures were still watching. For Mason, it wasn't about redemption anymore, it was about meaning. He and his brothers had spent years running from their pasts, but that day, they'd found something worth riding toward. A cause. A reminder that strength wasn't about fear, it was about protection. Years later, when the boy grew up, he would often tell the story. He'd say, "When I was little, someone broke my toy and hurt my mom. But then some men with loud bikes came. And they showed me what real heroes look like." And in a world that often forgot the power of standing up for the weak, the legend of that day and those bikers became a story people whispered with pride. A reminder that sometimes, even the roughest hands can heal what's been broken. So the next time you hear the rumble of engines on a quiet road, don't be too quick to judge. Maybe, just maybe, they're not running away, maybe they're riding towards something good.